Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with part 2 on this two-part video series for the 1/72nd scale USS Scamp SSN-588 fast attack sub. In the first installment, I showed this model being built from the point where I start the model all the way up to the point where it's ready for its weathering. Well, here you get to see what the model looks like fully completed. In this video, I'm going to be showing the model in this state, as well as going over several of the other features that the model does have. So stay tuned, because there's going to be a bunch of info coming right at you. To get this video started, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vessel here is the USS Scamp SSN-588. This version of the Scamp was a Skipjack class nuclear fast attack submarine. The previous USS Scamp was a Gato class diesel-electric submarine that saw service during World War II. Unfortunately, that submarine was lost during the war. And in honor of that submarine, the Navy went ahead and commissioned this vessel here with the same name. Like I just stated, the second USS Scamp was a Skipjack class of fast attack submarine. The Skipjack was a very important ship design in terms of US submarine development. As I touched upon in the other video, the Skipjack was the first to encompass two technologies that were developed by the US Navy at that time. The first was the nuclear power plant that was, of course, developed and utilized on the Nautilus. And the second technological advantage that was utilized on this design was the teardrop-shaped hull that was developed on the Albacore. The Skipjack class was developed in the 1950s. However, the vessels were finally exiting production in the early 1960s and were commissioned shortly thereafter. In total, there were 6 of the Skipjack class submarines that were built by the US Navy, and they were built by both Mare Island as well as Electric Boat Company. Of the 6 total boats, the Scamp was the second boat that was built in the Skipjack pattern. The merger of these two technologies gave the Skipjack a gigantic edge in both underwater performance, but also gave this vessel the ability to operate for long durations of time underwater. The Skipjack was such a leap in technology that the Navy themselves were so impressed that this was going to be the format that they would utilize for their nuclear submarines from henceforth onward. There were a few other nuclear submarines that were on the drawing board and were even about to be commissioned at that time, such as the USS Triton, which was basically still in the format of the Nautilus. However, those designs basically died in the Cold War, and all the US submarines from that point onward mimicked the Skipjack's type layout. And this is true for not just the fast attack sub role, but also for the SSBN role as well. When it comes to performance and actual stats, the Navy is not exactly very forthcoming on the information out there on the performance of their boats. However, what is estimated is that the Skipjack class, and of course this carries over to the Scamp itself, can run about 15 knots on the surface, 30 plus knots underwater, and has a test depth of about 700 feet. All of the Skipjacks have 6 bow torpedo tubes located in the very front portion of the submarine. Along with its torpedo tubes, the bow section of the Skipjack class was also dedicated to its echo and sonar equipment, which was located on both the top and bottom portion of the nose of this vessel. Of course, this is something that would change on later configurations of US attack subs, but for this pattern of boat, all 6 of the Skipjack class subs had the torpedoes and the sonar equipment arranged in this format. After the 6th and final Skipjack was delivered to the US Navy, the Navy retired this design and moved on to other designs which were improved upon what the Skipjack design brought to the table. However, that's of course a topic for another video for another day. The USS Scamp specifically was laid down on the 23rd of January 1959 at the Mare Island shipyard in California. It was launched on the 8th of October 1960 and entered into commission the 5th of June 1961. The Scamp had a very long and fruitful career with the US Navy that exceeded a time period of over 20-something years. The submarine was eventually decommissioned and removed from the Naval Register on the 28th of April 1988. It sat in the Puget Sound shipyard until 1994, when the vessel was then officially recycled, which means the majority of the vessel was cut up for scrap. However, the center portion where the reactor was housed was capped, sealed off, and is sitting in a graveyard with many other hull segments of its sister ships. Starting with the model's hull, as I touched upon in the first installment and also in the Skipjack video, the Moebius kit is unique because the entire hull is comprised of a 4-piece assembly, and because of that you will have some seam work to contend with. The seam work is not just found on where all 4 of these sections can join, but it's also present on this area over here where there's an integrally molded in seam that's to be an indication for the waterline. As I mentioned in great detail in the other video, this is something that I wanted to eliminate, and also the remainder of the bodywork needs to be done as well. Well, with the model fully completed, you can see that the hull is completely smooth and there are absolutely no traces of any of those seams that are present. On a similar note, as I touched upon in the other video, this particular example here, the hull needed to have been clamped into place in order to get the pieces to match the appropriate circumference. Well, now that the model is fully complete, you can see how successful I was in achieving that end result. The seam is somewhere in this area over here, and honestly, it's something that is almost impossible to point out because it's been blended in that well. One last thing that I do want to mention about the hull's bodywork involves the front sonar section as well as with the torpedo tubes. As I mentioned earlier, these areas here, namely the seam cut lines, need to have been cleaned up due to the bodywork process. Well, with the model fully completed, you again get to appreciate the end result. With the model placed on its side, here you really get to appreciate the underside detailing that's present on this kit. One of my favorite attributes about the Moebius kit is that you do have the floodgate detailing integrally molded in, and they did a really good job with it. The pieces are deeply molded, so in order to make them highlighted, the only thing you need to do is go over them with some kind of a panel line accent. Either a diluted black coloring, like I believe I did here, or some other technique that's similar will give you some excellent results. Moving towards the bow takes to the anchor. The anchor is the kit original unit, and it's a nicely rendered piece. In order to highlight it further, I went ahead and weathered it in the configuration that we have here. The anchor would get heavily scratched and scuffed up because really its only job is to be dumped and dragged occasionally on the ocean floor. For the weathering, I utilized just some dry brushing with some flat black, and it's applied via the fan brush. The next thing I want to mention involves a unsung hero in the world of ship models, and it's not with the model itself, it's actually the stand. You see, a stand is something that can actually make or break your ship model. The stand is extremely important because not only is it needed for display purposes, but unlike a tank or a plane where you can rest the vehicle on its running gear or its tracks, with a ship, obviously you can't do that. And a good stand needs to be able to cradle the boat and not have it shift, move, or possibly even cause damage. Obviously the kit supplies you with the stand, however in my opinion the Moebius kit supplied stand is a bit on the weaker end. The kit stand are comprising of 2 of these faux column-like objects that plug into the bottom portion of the hull, and as I touched upon in the first video, it's not really something I'm a fan of. The original locations were plugged up, so jumping back briefly to the under section here, the locations where the stand holes were present were thoroughly blended in, and I showed that in depth in the first video. But obviously with those areas removed, I'm going to need a new stand, and that is what we have right here. Some people out there utilize a foam type material, either a Frost King or some other type of styrofoam. However, you have to be cautious with that because although that may seem like a logical, safe bet, the problem is that material may have an adverse effect on the paint that's on the model. Keep in mind, these things aren't exactly moved very often off of their stands, and it's going to be making contact with the model for a great duration of time. Because of that, you run the risk of having the 2 materials have a negative reaction with each other, and this is something that I have personally seen a few times. For this model over here, I utilized a really low cost and a real simple solution in order to protect the model, and that is the use of blue painter's tape. I basically take the tape, cut it to the shape of the stand itself, and then just adhere it to the surface. The tape will have absolutely no reaction whatsoever to the paint used on the model, and it has a nice little soft texture to it so that the model can rest on the area over here without causing any sort of problems. Starting with the zinc plates, this was something that was very nicely executed on this model, but it's also a nice bit of detailing nonetheless. The real Submarine has the zinc plates in this configuration, and they are found on the top, the bottom, and also on the reverse sides. The zinc plates are there to prevent or mitigate corrosion found in these locations, and this is something that has been done on ships and submarines now for many, many decades. The kit also did a good job with rendering these components out. They could have taken a shortcut and just simply integrally molded these strips onto the hull. However, they went ahead and rendered them in a way that makes it a better quality model. The pieces are a single strip with their details present, and then they simply plug onto the hull in their corresponding locations. This was actually a really smart decision because these pieces here are one of those things that are best added to the model after everything's already painted and weathered. To paint these pieces, I simply use silver spray paint, and then I wash them with a diluted black in order to get that grungy, weathered look that you see here. The bottom portion where the areas plug into were airbrushed with this black type counter shading, so that once everything gets fitted in place, this is the end result that you get. At the very aft of the model takes to the propeller. This is the same prop that I touched upon in the other video, but here you get to see what it looks like carried to the next step with the addition of the weathering. As I touched upon in the other video, one common anachronistic trait that I've seen on a lot of nice ship builds out there is that they'll weather out the hull and even the superstructure. However, they'll leave the propeller shiny brass, and obviously this is something that hurts the look of the build. In order to weather a boat, you really need to keep everything on, lack of a better term, even keel. For the propeller here, I went ahead and weathered it with the following format. I airbrushed it with some diluted white, and I also went ahead and washed it with some diluted black. Once those two colors set, this is the end result, and as you can see, it's much more muted compared to the way it looked in the first installment. Moving upward takes us to the rudder and also that little axis hatch here. As I touched upon in the other video, one thing that I like to add to these Moebius skipjacks, or to improve the look, is with the addition of the small countersunk fasteners, which would be used to secure this plate here and several of the other plates to the vessel. This is done with a pin vise and a small Dremel bit. From the axis patch takes us back to the rudder. The rudder is the kit original one, of course, and here you get to see how it is rendered on this example. As I touched upon in the other video, this model here has the high red line, and because of that, I wanted to have the red line continue up to the tail fin, but it's obviously cut off at the waterline. This is something that was done and was seen on nuclear American submarines. One other thing I want to touch upon is with that gray stripe that we see here. This was mentioned in the previous video, but when I was building this version of Scamp, I saw some pictures of what the Scamp looked like shortly after launch and commissioning, and if you look at those pictures, you will see that the numbers are painted on the side, but they are on a gray stripe that you see here. This was done to not just the tail fin, but also to the side markings that are present on the front section of the hull. On the very top portion of the tail fin, of course, is a beacon. This beacon is a simple white light, and this is there just to let someone know that there's a tail fin over here, don't crash into it. Because one thing that's really neat about these American subs, specifically these teardrop shaped ones, is that they have a false waterline, if you see them, where the waterline ends right here, and you would think, well, that's the end of the vessel. Well, obviously there's a lot more going on beneath the surface, and the tail fin here does pop up. If the tail fin was all black and doesn't have a beacon on it, you could potentially see how that could cause some problems. Moving along the top deck takes us to the rear detailing that we have here. As I touched upon in the other video, this escape trunk hatch is the new HD 3D printed component from Iron Bottom Sound. Here you get to see what the piece looks like now, fully completed and fitted in place. Also, you can see the addition of the small little hooks that I touched upon in the other video. The addition of these details here really do spice the model up compared to just leaving it stock without any sort of additions being fitted. On that note, you can see the eyelet that was added to the rear marker buoy and the other countersunk fastener details that I added to the other various details. While on the topic of added holes, you get to see the limber holes that were added to the rear portion here of the induction cover. These, as I mentioned before, are integrally molded into the stock Moebius kit. However, they are a bit shallow, and it always looks good to drill them out thoroughly, specifically when it comes to things like limber holes. Along with the limber holes, you can see the bodywork, or you can't see the bodywork, again, that's the idea, found in this area over here, how everything is just blended together as one integral piece. Carrying on takes us to the rear sail beacon. This is the kit original clear plastic part, and it's very nicely done. However, one thing that I do want to touch upon is how to paint it. When you're building one of these models and you really want to make it go to the next step, a real simple thing to do is just paint the rear section of the plastic with a swipe of flat or gloss yellow. This will have the effect of when you look at the beacon from the sides, it will be totally clear. However, if you pivot the angle towards something that's a little bit flatter on, you can see how the beacon starts to become yellow, and this is something that is seen on the real vessels. It's a real simple thing to do, and once done will give you some excellent results. While on the sail, you get to see the other details that I mentioned in the other video, namely the countersunk fasteners that were added to all of the little axis panels. These, of course, were added with a pin vise, but now that the model is fully painted and weathered, they really do stick out and improve the model compared to leaving them flat. In order to highlight them further, I went ahead and used Tamiya panel line accent to really bring the color out, giving you the look that you see here. Also, while on this side, you can see the addition of the iron bottom sound side retracting beacons, now fully painted and fitted to the model. The beacons, of course, are a mirror image on the opposite side. However, the colors are indeed different. The one on this side here is in red, while the one on the opposite side is in green. Because these pieces are made with the HD 3D printed material, this is an excellent material for this type of application because of the crisp detailing that we can get shrunk down to this scale. Note it has the guards found in the midriff section over here, but you can also see integrally printed on the small little columns that are used to secure the two halves of the beacon in place. One other benefit that the piece has being made with this material is that this is a translucent material, and because of that, for things like beacons, it is ideal. Because the material is translucent, in order to paint them, you just paint the back section of the lights their appropriate color, in this case green, and with the one on the reverse side, red. Once the back sections are painted, you then paint the remainder of the exterior sections with a paintbrush to get the results that you see here. With the back sections painted, this brings the color out through the translucent material, and it yields for some very realistic results. Also, one other thing that you may notice about the beacons is that the inside portion that's generally kept in the retracted state are black. However, the hatch doors themselves on the reverse side are painted with the same color as the remainder of the sail. Moving our way to the front of the sail takes us to the windows. These pieces are the kit supply components and went on without any problems. They are nicely designed so that when they go into their appropriate locations, they fit on in a nice snug manner. To adhere them to the boat, like I mentioned in the Skipjack video, I utilize white glue for this because the white glue is something that gives you a bit of an insurance policy. You don't want to use super glue for adhering clear plastic on anything because when super glue sets, it tends to give off a white gas, which can destroy the clear plastic component. The white glue does not obviously do that, and also most importantly of the white glue is that if you have a mistake or if you add a little bit too much glue in one area or another, you can simply just wipe it off and it causes zero damage to the standard polystyrene or to the clear plastic window. If you are installing the piece in place and you have like a fingerprint or some other type of problem, you simply just wipe it off and you're good to go. Now, of course, if you're building this as a radio-controlled submarine, the white glue is, or standard Elmer's white glue specifically, is not going to be your best bet because it is definitely water soluble. However, if you are working on a RC sub, they do have waterproof white glue, which I can attest works fantastic on model RC ships, and for something like this application here, it would probably be a good bet. Also found in this location is the Iron Bottom Sound HD 3D printed front siren, or I believe it's a air horn. The piece was touched upon in the other video, and you get to see how much improved the model looks with the addition of this detailing in place. As I mentioned in the other videos, the kit just has a hole in this section over here without any sort of detailing present whatsoever. The iron bottom sound one just drops directly in place, giving you that much needed detailing. In addition to the horn, you also have this small little guard that comes down right here in the center. This was made from a piece of floor wire that was flattened and then just simply mounted in place. Once added, it really does give the model that much extra bit of detailing. From the sail, it takes us to the bow detailing, and we'll start with the escape trunk. The escape trunk hatch is again the HD 3D printed component that I mentioned before, and you can also see how it looks like paired up with those 4 little hooks that I also touched upon in the previous video. One interesting detail I want to point out about the escape trunk hatches is that you'll notice that there is no center hand wheel found on this hatch. And this is because this hatch cannot be opened from the exterior of the vessel and needs to be opened from the inside. I was recently chatting with a veteran from, oddly enough, the USS Scamp, and he was telling me that whenever they would enter or exit the submarine, it would be from the sail that we have right over here. This, of course, would be utilized for escape purposes if the submarine was stranded and was stuck on the bottom of the ocean and the crew needed to get out. A special type of diving bell would be dropped into this location over here, and that's what the purposes of these 4 hooks are for. The main hook in the center is where they would connect a winch, where they could open up the hatch from the inside, and then once this area here is opened up, the crew can embark inside of the rescue chamber, and then they could seal it up and go back to the surface. The top portion here is just a fairing, and obviously the real pressure load section of the hatch would be found directly beneath. So obviously you can see why the omission of this component from the Moebius kit is something that can really leave room for improvement. The last bit of detailing to mention on this boat is with the array. The array that you see here is the kit original detailing, and it was simply assembled by and large out of the box. You'll notice that on this one here, the array is a little bit different compared to the way I rendered it on my Skipjack. On the Skipjack, the camouflage pattern was applied via the paintbrush, while this one here, I went with an airbrush route. As for which one's accurate, well, they both are. There are lots of examples of both types of camouflage patterns found on the periscope fairings. Basically, these were applied at the shipyard, and depending on who was applying it or what equipment they had at the time, I have seen examples where the little camouflage pattern was applied via spray gun, and I've also seen it applied with a paintbrush. So whichever way works for you, which again gives you a little bit more variation to add to your collection where you can have really no 2 boats look alike. One other little bit of detailing that I want to mention, and something that's not really known or discussed in other videos, is the composition of the periscopes. The tubes that actually go up and down on the real submarine have a certain format to them. The one scope over here, which I believe is called the attack scope, the tube itself is just left in its shiny chrome. However, the smaller scope is in this configuration that we have here, and this is something that I have seen on several of the post-World War II submarines, from Bakuna to Torsk, and I believe even Nautilus. The secondary scope has a tinted metal tube for some reason or another. I'm pretty sure some sub-vet here could easily clarify on this. However, for the model over here, in order to replicate in this format, I took some of the Vallejo silver chrome paint and I added a few drops of black to it, giving it for the look that we have here. Once added, you can really see how it changes the look of this scope compared to just rendering everything in silver. One other thing to mention while on the topic of silver is with the rear snorkel and the induction. Of course, because the submarine is nuclear powered, that doesn't mean it's solely powered by nuclear power. The submarine does have a diesel engine found in the boat, and it needs a snorkel, and the snorkel is in the rear section of the sail as it was on the guppy pattern of boats. The snorkel is the kit original unit, and to properly render it, basically the top portion here is painted with the same color as the sail, while the midsection here would be left in silver or aluminum. On this one example, I went ahead and drilled out the 2 sections here of the exhaust manifold, which are just 2 little molded in squares, giving it for a little bit better accuracy. However, the snorkel induction is admittedly one of the weaker aspects found on the kit's detailing. So much so that on the iron bottom sound detail set that I've already touched upon and shown in the other video, I actually went ahead and also tooled up a replacement snorkel and induction. You can see some pictures of the renderings right there in the corner of the screen, and you can see how much more evolved and advanced it is compared to the stock original unit. With the way these snorkel inductions are, the front section is the actual induction. This is what air gets funneled into the boat from the environment. And this section over here is the exhaust, and this is where the diesel exhaust would emerge from. To design the induction piece, this was something that took a bit of extra research, because trying to find a photograph of one of these nuclear subs from this era with the induction up is not exactly that easy to come by, but I was able to muscle through, giving it for the appropriate detailing. Also, something else that's missing on this section over here is the Grimes light, which would be located right here on the top. This is something that I may or may not change on this example here, and possibly even upgrade my Skipjack, but that's something that remains to be seen, and it's really out of the scope of this video. However, the ECA, or I should say the IBS piece, and of course I have it, is designed to replace just the top portion here altogether. So basically you keep this section, you amputate this area, and then you drop in the new replacement component. For weathering it, this is still done the exact same way. With a airbrush, I added some exhaust soot into these two locations, because obviously this is where the exhaust soot, or the exhaust smoke, would emerge from the diesel engine. And this brings us to the paint and the markings. Like I mentioned in the other video, I wanted this version to be very different compared to the last Skipjack that I built. So I went ahead and found some images of Scamp, and I like the configuration that we have here. In this type of format, this is what the Scamp would look like shortly after launch and commissioning. So we'll see the high waterline with the red. The above waterline section is all painted in black. The dive planes are black. The sail is blue. The top portion doesn't have any counter shading on it. And then there's a little bit of counter shading here done on the rear portion of the induction cover. Also, it would be in this period where you would see those gray rectangles painted on the sides in order to add highlight and make the draft numbers a little bit more legible. For the weathering, I wanted this one to be a little bit more weathered compared to the Skipjack, where if we touch upon with that one, I went ahead and added the bathtub ring as well as the algae growth. For this one, I just wanted to make it look like it was in the water for a little bit longer period of time. So the bathtub ring is a little bit more thicker, and the algae itself is also more pronounced compared to the last build. For the remainder of the weathering work, this was done with the same type of format, where I used airbrushing, washes, and also quite a bit of paint brushing in order to add all the streaks that you see. The streaks are comprising of both rust, but also you'll see some salt lines that would be present specifically when this thing comes on the surface, the water drains out, it would dry up, and you would have a nice little white line found in these locations over here. On the sail, I was inspired by several pictures of the Scorpion, where I had some really good high-res images, and you do see some rust streaks developing coming off of several of these axis panels. For the markings, these are the kit supplied water slide decals, and the kit supplied decals are excellent. They simply went on without any problems, and then everything was varnished over, leaving for the end result that we have here. For the varnish, I utilized the same VMS matte varnish that I talk about in my tank videos. Bouncing back to the topic of the weathering, one thing that I do want to mention is how to weather in context on ships. And this is something that I've seen, and it seems like ship guys always seem to do this. They don't really understand how these things would weather in real life. I've seen far too many examples where the ship is very beautifully made, right? But from the waterline up, it's weathered. Waterline down, totally clean, red hull. I mean, you know, you got to use your imagination. This part is in salt water literally 24 hours a day for months on end. It's going to have biofouling on it. It's going to start showing age and decay. You cannot just have the top part look all weathered and the bottom part be clean. It just doesn't work that way. And for some reason, ship guys always seem to render them in that format. It's one of those things that always eludes me as to how that can be the case. But if you want to go a step further, from this point onward, you can technically also add barnacles and other type of marine growth to the side of the hull. It's not really for me, but that is something that can also be done by the builder if they deem fit. One other thing that I want to mention that I did talk about in the previous video is with the types of colors that were used. For this one here, the colors are basically El Cheapo spray paints. I use Home Depot brand flat black for the top, The red hull is Ace branded red oxide primer, and the gray is Tamiya German gray. The German gray was done with the airbrush, and basically all the other major paintwork was done with the spray paint. But one other thing I want to mention is also with the type of paints. There is this notion out there that the submarines are painted in gloss, and this may be true when brand new, you know, when the thing is launched. However, after not really a long period of time being exposed to both the salt water and the sun, the gloss is the first thing that goes. So this is something to keep in mind when you're rendering out a boat like this. One other misconception out there is that nuclear submarines are boring with their paintwork. Well, that's definitely not the case. As you can see, the two boats look completely different from one another, and you even have several other variations that you could do past these two here. There are lots of other sail options with the way it's painted that I have yet to build, and we'll probably see that as time goes on.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
But also, again, we have high waterline, low waterline. This one here, the front's painted gray. This one's left in black. I've even seen one example of one of the boats where this was left in silver or aluminum in color. So again, there are lots of variations out there between the boats in the Skipjack class. Also keep in mind, the Skipjack wasn't surfaced for a long period of time. So even the same boat went through different variations of itself as its service life continued. From this point on, these are really more or less early renditions of the boat, but keep in mind, by the time the boats were retired, they had all sorts of different arrays and changes that were made to them that differentiate them from their early counterparts here. But again, that's something more or less for another video for another day. While I have both boats out, I do briefly want to mention the details that I added to this one as opposed to leaving it stock. Skipjack here, I left stock, and you can see the stock configuration of the hatch outside the little lift hooks that I added myself. But on this version here of the Scamp, you get to see what it looks like with the iron bottom sound hatch installed. Like I mentioned before, it really does change the look of the model, giving it that much more accuracy and realism as opposed to the stock. But, you know, I could say that all day long, but when you actually see it in person, it definitely is something that looks more eye-catching. One other thing I want to mention is with the beacons. On this one here, obviously, again, built out of the box, while this one here, I went ahead and added the side navigation beacons. This is something that's purely optional because, again, these would only be extended like this when the boat was on the surface. If the boat was going to be underwater, the beacons are folded up like the way you see here to leave for a sleeker, less drag-prone type appearance. Also, hopping back to the array, you get to see the two options on how they can be painted. This one here was done via the airbrush, while this one here was done with the paintbrush. Both renditions are accurate. It just depends which version of the boat you want to render. Moving on to skill level and recommendation, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because, well, I've done that in great depth in the Skipjack build video. However, this model here is highly recommended for anyone who's an avid submarine model fan, or if you're just a fan of Cold War American Navy vessels. The Skipjack is a very influential submarine, of course, and if you're a fan of the U.S. Submarine Force, this kit here is a definite no-brainer. One person who I do not recommend this kit for would be someone who hates bodywork. If you're the type of person that doesn't like to deal with seam lines or excessive amount of sanding or polishing, as you can clearly see in part 1 of this video series, this is not going to be the kit for you because this model is basically 70% bodywork and about 20% actual assembly. So that is something to factor in. This model can also be radio controlled. A lot of people have done it on YouTube. However, it's not as simple as the box may make it seem to be. There are several modifications that need to be done by the builder, and these are things that are definitely outside the purview of the kit and require a little bit of extra elbow grease. However, I'll leave that up to those RC YouTube channels to go over in more depth. With the relatively low cost and high availability of these kits here, it's no doubt that I am going to pick up the remainder of the kits in the line just so that I could flesh out all 6 of the Skipjack class family. I already got 2. There's only a handful more to go, and as time goes on, I'm definitely going to start filling in those gaps. Which is actually pretty cool because, again, each one of these boats do have different features and attributes and details to them, which is something that is definitely going to translate into my own personal builds. But this is something best to be discussed and seen in future model showcase videos. However, just like I mentioned in the Skipjack video, the one downside on these Moebius kits is that Moebius themselves never expanded the 1/72nd scale sub line. So the only kits out there are their Skipjacks, and it would be really cool if they ever tooled up some other kits in the same range, like the Permit, the Sturgeon, the George Washington, so on and so forth. There's a lot of really cool post-war, Cold War era American subs, like the Ethan Allen or the Patrick Henry. That's one with the Siamese twin type sail found on the bow, but it's neither here nor there. At least the one positive note is that I'm not going to be distracted, and I could fully flesh out my 6 boats in the Skipjack range. So there is a silver lining, I guess. And it looks like it's about time to pack up because the rains are coming. And no, the irony is not lost on me with the subject matter. With that in mind, I guess that's a perfect place to end this video off. So that wraps up this model showcase video for the 1/72nd scale USS Scamp SSN-588 fast attack sub. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being other 1/72nd scale Skipjack class subs that may or may not be in the pipeline, or the other content that gets posted to this channel, which is small and large scale model military vehicle builds. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components, as well as swing by Iron Bottom Sound for 1/72nd scale Skipjack detail upgrades. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one, which will probably be the USS Scorpion, but that remains to be seen. Thanks again, guys. Take care.